The title of this talk is Planning Beyond the Page, which is a little like highfalutin, high concept stuff. Basically, it's about changing ways of approaching the concept of like how we plan out content for the website, or for any website really. As was mentioned earlier, I'm Eaton. I work for Lullabot. We're one of the companies that helped with a lot of the initial planning and the development for the platform. And I got to tell you, we really have loved the experience of working with the digital services team and like everyone at the different agencies that we've had a chance to talk to and work with. It's been a really meaningful project for us. And we'll get into some of the reasons why a little later, but it's been a real honor working with everybody, and I'm really excited as sites are starting to roll out the stuff that's going to be able to happen. So if there's one short takeaway that I want to like make sure is a part of this, it's the idea that pages aren't content, they're where content lives. That's a big shift, and this talk is going to be about like how that shift has happened, but that's really the heart of it. And it's one of the things that with all the different companies that we've worked with and all the different organizations we've worked with, like through all of Lullabot's clients and projects, that's one of the trickiest shifts we find for people, because the idea of pages as like this fundamental thing that we make every day is really strong. And moving beyond that is a big part of being ready for new ways that people are trying to find answers and find information online. So I'm going to take the dangerous step of starting with a joke. This is actually less of a joke and more of a story. Years back, in one of our earlier projects, a coworker and I had been on site, sort of babysitting a fairly large site through its launch, and we were wiping our brows, and everything went off okay. It was actually the World Wrestling Entertainment Company, which is a whole nother zany story, but the idea was, it was the end of the day, we were relieved, everything had gone right, and we went out and we were gonna get drinks and celebrate. And we ended up talking to the bartender, and he says, "Oh, what do you do?" And we're like, "Oh, well, we do websites." He's like, "Oh, my cousin does that." And it was like, "So, you were just working on one. How many pages was it?" It's like, and we were like thinking through. It's like, well, it's maybe like 10 different templates, but like, maybe kind of, we're like, 1 million? And his eyes just got real big, and he says, "Whoa, that's a lot of pages." And he wasn't wrong. It was indeed a lot of pages that had been made, but we were building it with a CMS, and a lot of it was migration, and they had a team that was for it. So it wasn't so much that he was wrong, it was just the wrong way of thinking about what the work was, and the wrong way of thinking about like even what people went to the website for. They wanted to know what was going on in Big Show's life, not, what page they were looking at. And, it's interesting because that idea of the page as the fundamental thing goes way, way back. When I first started, building websites, this was literally what the back end of the website looked like. I found this screenshot from my desktop many, many years ago, and that is the actual directory structure of a website I had been working on. It was, folders that were full of HTML files, and you made them, and it wasn't bad. It worked, and you look at websites from that era. The Apple homepage introducing CyberDrive. No one remembers CyberDrive, but you could get it on CD-ROM. And over time, who here has been through, quote, a redesign? Yeah, that's the bitter laughter of experience. And the idea was, it's a redesign was basically, well, you took all the old folders full of stuff and you moved them somewhere and you rebuilt a new set of them. And then over time, as things changed and, the look and feel got different, new things would keep rolling out and forcing us to rebuild the website and remake all of those pages. And was years back that I started thinking about a story that this reminded me of. Is anybody familiar with the Ballad of John Henry? Like a steel driver from the 1870s. His job was like to pound railroad spikes into railroad ties as they were like laying down the tracks. And the story is basically about his race against a steam engine. They were just rolling out the new steam engine that could do the same thing, and he went out and competed with a steam engine in this pitched battle, and he had a hammer in each hand, and he was pounding stakes. And at the end of this thing, he won. He laid down more track than the steam engine could, and then he died of a heart attack. And I mean, man, if there is not a story that feels like true to the life of a webmaster, I do not know what could be. And that idea of the webmaster's job is to keep making pages and keep updating pages feels very much like the story of John Henry to me. And because, despite all of the advances and the tools we've got to build this stuff, a lot of our terminology and a lot of our thinking, even if the tools have moved past pages, all of the stuff that we talk about is still very centered around, well, we've got to put a new page on a website. Can you go update that page? Stuff like that. And it gets us by. It gets more and more time consuming and labor intensive and stuff like that, but it gets us by. But the real problem underneath just like the labor that goes into that kind of approach is that it treats the stuff, friends of mine are sharply divided on whether this is amusing or deeply horrifying. It's like, this is chicken, in a manner of speaking. The idea is that the page view of the world treats the content, the meaningful stuff that's there that people are looking for, as goo that gets poured into pages. The idea is, well, we need to make a new page. We need to make a new design. We need to make a new whatever. And the stuff that people are actually getting out of it just sort of gets stuffed into those new shapes. And if there isn't a box for the content that makes sense, usually ends up living in some awkward tucked away place because, we couldn't figure out this idea of the page as the central organizing unit of the website was maybe sustainable, even through all the redesigns and all the updates and stuff like that, when all we were really worried about was the website. Keep that updated. Maybe every 6 months we'll go through and review if there's old stuff on there, something like that. That's fine. But then organizations that were like trying to keep, say, all of their printed materials in sync with the website, suddenly they've got this explosion of additional work on top of that. And then when you start thinking about organizations where people are coming to them from lots of different places to get that information, suddenly each one of those different channels that people are coming through has slightly different needs. Some of them, the idea of a page might map well to some of those places, like a search engine or whatever. It's ultimately going to find a page, so that's fine. But like email updates or stuff that the call center is looking for information about, or say if you perhaps work for an organization that has like an Alexa app that people can ask questions of and it will give them answers, none of those things really even fit conceptually very well to the idea of a page. And that means that now you're stuck producing the same stuff for each and every single one of those channels. Now, a CMS can help with that, but if the things you're making in the CMS are pages, and that's your central way of looking at everything, this is a huge pain. So this brings us back to that idea of page equals content as our sort of fundamental sin that all of us who grew up in like the making pages era of websites have inherited. That's a fundamental problem. These things aren't synonymous with each other. And in a way, it's sort of like we're building books over and over and over and over again, or manuals or things like that. And that's not shocking because so much of what we understand about how stuff gets published and stuff gets into people's hands is inherited from publishing books. It's something humanity's been doing for an extremely long time, and we got extremely good at it. And we like to see old patterns that we understand in new things. But I guess the question I started asking myself, is the pageness of a book what people care about? The answer is no. It's the stuff on the page. It might be useful, like, oh, this is on page 85, but the 85-ness of that page isn't what really matters. It's what's on it. And a friend of mine, Karen McGrain, a content strategist and designer, incredibly smart, and has lots of fun quotes for stuff like this. One of the things that she said is that, the way we publish on the web is mostly derived from putting ink on paper. Even the idea of like a WYSIWYG editor, what you see is what you get. The company that first designed that concept was Xerox, because they had invented photocopiers and laser printers, and people with computers, what they wanted to do was figure out, but how do I put a thing on this physical page? And thus WYSIWYG editing was born. So this stuff is really deeply baked into how we understand these things. And one of the things she talks about, though, is that in the future of content, where things are going and how people try to access this stuff, it isn't derived from that page and printing and publishing centric model. It's in like smaller bits that can be assembled into new containers as needed. That idea of like smaller discrete objects making up the page rather than the page being the big thing is a really big shift. And we're going to talk about like what that means and how that plays out and how to start thinking about the day-to-day process of like answering people's questions and building out content from a slightly different angle that doesn't make pages the center of the universe. So one of the first steps that we usually take is, and this is something that like we did a lot of work with the digital services team over the course of about 5 or 6 months, looking at what stuff do you publish? And this is not just something that's specific to the state of Georgia. Almost all of our clients, that's the first kind of question we ask. And like an example might be a topic. We talk about topics. That's a nice generic sounding, phrase. And then you start digging deeper and it gets a lot more complicated. We've got bios, we've got forms that people submit. Sometimes we need to put up an alert because something is going on. And these aren't necessarily discrete kinds of pages on a website. It's the kinds of things we're making and figuring out like what those core nouns are, the stuff we make, things people are asking us, stuff like that is the starting point. And then we can start digging a little deeper and asking like, okay, for an agency, what is an agency? When we say we need to, add a new agency to the site, what does that mean? Well, we ask things like, a name, what is its mission? What's the contact information for it? Does it have a logo? Are there keywords for it that should be used when, somebody searches for it? Is there a Twitter handle for that agency? All of those things become the bits of information that capture like agency-ness. And well, that's that's what we call the content model. That's that kind of breakdown for all of the different kinds of things you make. That's the content model, and that's what goes into the CMS. The different pieces, the building blocks that you get when you say, I need to make some new stuff. These are what you're choosing from, and then what you're populating the different things you're making with. So that's sort of the building blocks, the figuring out what those nouns are, what things you publish,